Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammāṃ Saṅghāṃ namasāmi. Tradition has it that approximately the first year after the Buddha's enlightenment, on the full moon of the second month of the year, there was a spontaneous gathering of 1,250 arhats, 1,250 fully enlightened beings, spontaneously gathered, came to see the Buddha on the full moon night. And this was such an auspicious and special occasion that we celebrate it to this day as the Buddhist holiday of Magha Puja. So the Apposita on the full moon and new moons was a special time when people from different traditions would come together and maybe practice together or meditate together, reaffirm their teachings, have a discussion. So on this night, they had heard the Buddha was staying in a particular place, and without prior arrangement, a huge gathering, 1,250 fully enlightened beings came and paid respects to the Buddha. And the Buddha gave a very brief teaching, but a teaching that was very much to the point. And because it was at the beginning of his teaching career, he was just beginning to gather momentum in what would later be known as the Buddhist tradition. And at that time, when you have an audience of 1,250 fully enlightened beings, you don't need to say a whole lot. You don't need to give a whole lot of detail. They've already fully grasped the essence of the Dhamma. So it was interesting to see what the Buddha would teach. If you were going to give a Dhamma talk to over 1,000 fully enlightened people, what would you say? This teaching then became known as the Ovada Patimokkha Gatha. Now the first line of this teaching is Kanti Paramang Tapotitika. Patient endurance is the supreme austerity. And now most of the people in the audience that the Buddha was addressing were formerly very hardcore ascetics. In the time of the Buddha, it was a tradition that people who were seeking liberation would try various ways, and one of the most common ways was to try to liberate the mind through working off old karma, ending one's karma through torturing the body. And there were many ways of doing this. The Buddha himself engaged in this practice, experimented with it prior to his own enlightenment, sometimes doing practices such as holding his breath, living in extreme seclusion, and eating very, very little, wearing away the body's energy, really testing that path to its ultimate. And even after his enlightenment, there were many, many groups who were doing the same. After there were 60 arhats, there was a meeting, and the Buddha encouraged them, the first 60 arhats, to go out and spread the Dhamma for the welfare of the many. And he said, but I'll be going to Gaya, because in Gaya there was a group of 1,000 matted hair ascetics under the guidance of the three Kassapa brothers. And the Buddha went and stayed with the most senior of the Kassapa brothers. And they were very impressed with him, but the leader of this group of Madhya ascetics he was a bit difficult to convince. Because, of course, the Buddha was still relatively young, a newcomer, whereas the senior Kassapa brother was very well established as a teacher. And he had 500 disciples that he was living with, and the other two brothers each had approximately 250. Now these ascetic, matted hair wanderers were considered to be fire worshippers. And from the 21st century perspective, it may seem kind of an odd thing to do, to worship fire, or, we don't really know if they were worshiping fire, but certainly they were considered they considered the fire as sacred. And they were living a very hardcore life. They were naked. In northern India, if you've ever gone on pilgrimage in the cold season, northern India can get very, very cold. It can even snow there. And they were living without clothes. They were bathing in the freezing waters. They had possibly no possessions, or very few possessions. Often gather alms just with their bare hands. So they were very, very serious practitioners. And we may think it odd, this idea that people would want to torture the body in order to achieve spiritual liberation. But if you've ever done a meditation retreat, if you're sitting there for days on end, your knees start to ache, and your back starts to ache, your mind starts to ache, then you realize that there's a certain amount of old karma that starts to ripen, either physically or mentally, when we start to dedicate ourselves to practice. And the results of past bad karma that we've made, when it comes to the surface, it manifests as discomfort or pain in some way, whether it's physical pain or mental pain. And then with Buddhist practice, if we're aware of that, acknowledge it, and then let it go, it's like that bit of bad karma is burned away, is let go of. Now, there was a general idea at the time that liberation would be achieved if you burned off all of your old bad karma. Just burn it all up. Now, the Buddha said that this was impossible, but the idea was that, if you were very serious about this practice, and, if you're just sitting and doing meditation or retreat, your bad karma kind of comes up sometimes, together with your results of good karma, but when the bad karma arises, it manifests as difficulties, and then you have to be patient with it and let it go. So their idea was to speed up the process by inflicting as much pain as possible, or living very, very simply, and practicing very intensely. So there was a certain logical rationale behind living the life of asceticism. And certainly they had tremendous dedication to be able to live that lifestyle. But they were missing a few key elements. And so when the Buddha went to stay with them, then he gradually gained their confidence. And the leader of the Kassapa brothers finally relented and expressed his wish to become the Buddha's disciple. And then all of the other Kassapa disciples followed suit. And they shaved off all of their long matted dreadlocks, threw it into the river, and then joined the very young Sangha. So the majority of the audience that the Buddha was addressing on this full moon night in the Indian countryside were these people who had been practicing very hardcore asceticism for a long, long time. And it's interesting then that the very first line of the teaching is, the most extreme, or the ultimate ascetic practice is patience. Just being patient. It doesn't sound quite as dramatic as sleeping in a bed of thorns, or standing on one foot for 5 years, or bathing naked in the Ganges River, or rolling in the snow naked, or any of these things. But in terms of liberating the mind, patient endurance is the supreme austerity. And so with many things, the Buddha would take an idea that was current at that time, a spiritual idea, and then put a bit of a spin on it, put his own spin on it, redefine it. So here he then talks about the ultimate ascetic practice is not torturing the body, but is actually a mental attitude shift. So when difficulties come up, when frustration arises, when we don't get what we want, when we get stuck with what we don't want, when we're separated from the people that we love, or we feel lonely, or we have physical difficulties, we feel sick, or we're feeling frustrated, or feeling angry, or filled with passionate desires, and the Buddha says, just be patient. Just be patient, because when these things arise in consciousness, if we're aware of them, we're patient with them, they have a certain amount of energy that then manifests. And if we're patient, eventually that karmic energy will dissipate. Karmic energy will gradually wear off. Now, it's not the case that we have to wear away all of our old bad karma. That would be impossible. But it is the case that in the process of purifying our minds, in the process of developing samadhi, in the process of developing inner peace, then a certain amount of purification through the ripening of past karma is part of the process. Now, a certain amount of difficulties arise simply through living simply. For example, in the forest tradition, we don't intentionally go to torture ourselves. But sometimes people look at our lifestyle and they think that looks like self-torture. So, well, the Buddha taught the middle way, right? Your lifestyle looks too difficult. But something like sleeping on the floor, eating one meal a day, living a life of celibacy, not going to movies. We don't even get to know who the Oscar winners are. So there's a lot of renunciation, but the essence of renunciation is simplicity. Just the idea that we'll simplify life. And in the process, it means we have to be patient. Because in the modern life, there's a lot of pressure to keep pleasant feeling happening all the time, from moment to moment to moment. Right? When we see something, we want it to be beautiful or attractive. Or if it's ugly, then we try to get rid of it. We look in the mirror, if we see something ugly, we try to change something, get rid of it. We see something in our house that is ugly, and we try to change it, try to make things beautiful. And that creates a lot of pressure. Or if there's sound that's unpleasant, we try to cover it up, but change it, try to have pleasant sounds through music all the time. Or unpleasant sounds such as criticism, we try to get rid of that. Have pleasant sounds such as praise. But that takes work. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of pressure just to keep the body comfortable with the right temperature all the time, wherever we go. Not too hot, not too cold. There's a very narrow window. It's not too hot, not too cold. But of course, if you simplify life, if you live in the forest, if you live in a small hut, then you don't have much control over that. You have to let go. And you just have to be patient. When it's too hot, and you're sweating, you just have to be patient. Let go. And when it's too cold, you just have to be patient. In a sense, it's very liberating, because trying to keep all of our sense doors operating at pleasantness 24/7 is a burden. You think of all the work that we go through just so that our tongue experiences pleasant sensation. Right? The shopping, the cooking, the preparation, the cleaning up, tremendous amount of work just so that our tongue tastes something pleasant. That's what we call delicious. But really the most important or key aspect of all of this is the mind. You can have everything operating at ultimate pleasant levels with seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, but if the mind is experiencing suffering, then it's like none of it matters. But if you're living very simply, or if we're living in circumstances where, some things are pleasant, some things are unpleasant, which is quite natural, and the mind's at peace, then it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. You can accept that. Some things are pleasant, some things are unpleasant. And there's a lot of freedom there. It's like a trap to be stuck in this idea that we have to keep working to make everything pleasant. So patient endurance. Now patient endurance is basically an attitude shift. So we don't intentionally inflict difficulties on our body when we practice, when you do an intensive retreat, or when we ordain or live in small huts, and we experience a lot of physical difficulties. You think monk is being easy. Being a monk is easy, you should try it. Just try it for a while. You get a taste of what it's like to have so much out of control, and just to sleep on a bare floor, and just to give up. You have to give up so much. Our teacher, Ajahn Chah, would make a lot of this teaching of patient endurance, kanti parami, patience, endurance, and it's not enduring with a way of gritting your teeth, because that has very limited value. In fact, that can even strengthen the ego. You say, I can take it. I'm not a wimp. I'm not a wimpy monk that's going to give up. I can take it. I can sit longer than the others without moving. I can sit all night long. We do this all-night practice. When Lumpur Piak was here just a few nights ago, I heard you did the all-night practice. That's a good one for developing patience. And when I was a young monk, every week we would do one night of that. And sitting meditation all night long sounds like a great idea at 7 in the evening. You think, oh yes, wonderful, we're just very peaceful. But then as the hours go by, it really takes a lot of energy. By 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, a bit hard work. Not quite, sitting for half an hour, 45 minutes, very peaceful. But once you get into the second, third hour, then it's, you have to work a bit. And really be patient. You have to be patient with all of our mind states that come up. Just be patient with feelings of sleepiness. You get to about 11:30 or so, and you're really wilting, and then at midnight you get a cup of coffee, and that perks you up for a while. But then by 1:30, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., it's really a practice of just being awake, developing wakefulness. It's the path of wakefulness. Just keep going, be patient. Be patient with all the thoughts that say, oh, this is extreme asceticism. This is not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught the middle way. He didn't teach to torture the body. But again, it's an attitude shift, like many things. Ajahn Chah didn't worry too much about what meditation technique people used, but he was very concerned about their attitude towards it and having the correct attitude towards practice. So basically, if we've mastered this relationship of patient endurance as a way of purifying the mind, then you can apply it in nearly every aspect of our lives. It doesn't have to be dramatic, sitting all night long, but just when someone in your family does something really irritating, we could react with not liking it, blaming the other person, finding fault. Or we could just watch our minds, watch the reaction in our own minds and be patient with that. Knowing that every time we do that, it's like we gradually wear away our own defilements. Someone says something that's a bit critical. Well, that's unfair. That's not true. Who are you? Oh, you look at yourself, man. But just watching the reaction that comes up in our mind and say, okay, well, can I use this as a practice? And then just let go. Just watch. And then, as time goes on, our negative or unwholesome reactions become less and less. They lose their strength. Patient endurance is like having a tiger in a cage. We all have tigers in our mind, whether they're tigers of passionate lust or tigers of anger. Sometimes the tiger can just lash out, and if you're not careful, it can attack somebody. But patient endurance is like putting the tiger in a cage. You don't have to get in there and kill the tiger with a knife. You just don't feed it. Right? You put the tiger in a cage, and then you don't feed it by continually giving energy to our unwholesome states of mind. And then gradually, the tigers of defilements lose their energy. They gradually become weaker and weaker. One of the areas that is most important to be patient is being patient with ourselves. Especially when it comes to Buddhist practice. We may have been practicing for many years, and then something happens, we get angry, and we think, oh boy, I'm a failure, I'm a bad Buddhist. I should know better than this by now. But we just have to be patient with ourselves and realize that we're all human, and it's a long process. And often there are many things that are out of our control, so we can't say how long it's going to take before we really achieve a deep state of peace that's not going to be shaken. So be very patient with yourself. Every time thoughts of self-criticism arise, just be patient. Okay, that's just a thought of self-criticism. Never mind. Be patient with that. Let it go. Now the second line of this teaching is Nibbanang Paramang Vadanti Buddha. The Buddhists say Nibbana is the supreme goal. So Nibbana is often translated as awakening or enlightenment. Literally means cooling. Cooling. It's like the fires have gone out. Again, the Buddha was talking to mainly the former fire-worshipping ascetics. And when He gained their confidence initially. Again, he took that theme of fire worshipping and turned it around, and then that became his third major teaching, which was then known as the fire sermon, or the Dhamma teaching concerned with fire. And he used that simile of fire then throughout many of his teachings. Nibbana itself is like the ultimate cooling of the mind. The fires of the mind have gone out. Even the hot coals in the mind have gone out. One's completely cooled. Cooled in a very positive way, in the sense that the fires of greed, the fires of anger and hatred, the fires of passionate lust, the fires of delusion, they've all ceased, they've all gone out. And then what's left is very, very peaceful. And we don't get burned, and we don't burn others. So there are many things that we could aspire to in life, thinking of what's a successful life? How do you define success? What is worthy of aspiring to? But the Buddha made it very clear that Nibbana is the ultimate thing to aspire to. And in terms of spiritual goals, he made it clear that the purpose of his practice, the purpose of his Dhamma teachings, was this awakening, this cessation of all defilements that he called Nibbana. So it wasn't heaven. The idea wasn't do enough good karma and then be reborn in heaven. Because compared to Nibbana, it's quite a shallow goal. It's nothing it's still a good thing. If you happen to be reborn in heaven, don't worry about it. Although there are some stories in the suttas where, like there's one where a monk dies, he's practicing so hard, in the process he dies, and then he's reborn in heaven, and he's really disappointed. What is this, I'm just still surrounded by delusion. I was practicing for the ultimate, for Nibbana, and here I am stuck in heaven. So the Buddha made it very clear. The purpose of the practice is for realizing full awakening. Nothing short of that. The next line goes, Nahi papajito parupagati samano hoti parang vihetayanto. So, one who has gone forth does not harm others. Someone who harms others is not a contemplative. Again, we have the emphasis on non-violence from the very beginning. The encouragement to be kind, to be compassionate, an essential part of the Buddhist teaching. For anyone who has gone forth from the world, even if you still have a family, still work, still have all the responsibilities of being in the world, if your heart has gone forth, then it's like saying, I've turned my back on harming other people. I've turned my back on harming other beings. I'm devoting myself to a life that's non-violent physically, non-violent verbally. I'm not going to harm any people with speech. I don't even want to harm other people with thoughts. Thoughts are powerful. Our minds are powerful. So maybe we don't do anything or don't say anything, but we have really nasty thoughts. It's like, well, that's also harming. It harms other people, but certainly it harms ourselves. Before it harms anyone else, it pollutes our own mind. So the Buddha encourages having thoughts of kindness, compassion. The next stanza is quite famous. Many people have seen it. It is like a succinct summary in and of itself of the Buddhist path. Sabapa pasa akaranang kusala supa sampada satita pariyodapanang etang buddha nasasanang. So, not doing any bad karma, not following any unwholesome states of mind, not making any unwholesome karma, and developing wholesome karma to its utmost. And then purifying consciousness. This is the teaching of the Buddha. You'll find this in the Dhammapada as well. So refraining from unwholesome actions. Again, this is where we come into sila, or morality, whether it's 5 precepts, 8 precepts, living a life of a monastic. Important aspect of this whole path of practice is at least let's put the brakes on making any more bad karma. Right? We'll just really do our best not to make any more bad karma. The bad karma that we've made in the past, we'll just have to be patient with as the results gradually arise. There's nothing we can do about that. Sometimes we've made mistakes, but at least from now on, let's make the utmost effort to stop making any more bad karma, or at least reduce it as much as possible. We can't just start and say, okay, from this point on, I'm never going to make any more bad karma, because sometimes bad karma is very subtle. Sometimes it's just a thought. It's not heavy bad karma, but it's a subtle, refined bad karma. But with mindfulness, then we can begin to differentiate, first of all, what is what we consider bad or akusala, unwholesome karma, or good, kusala, wholesome karma. What's the difference between bad and good? I mean, if you ask the average person in different societies, in different times, what's bad and what's good, you'll get different answers. Different personalities will have different answers. Well, if I like it, then it must be good. But the Buddha had a very clear definition of what was kusala and akusala. He doesn't actually use the word good and bad, but something more precise. Kusala refers to any states of mind which are not arising from the root defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion. And akusala, unwholesome, any states of mind that are arising from greed, hatred, and delusion. So then, if we start to increase our mindfulness and be very diligent and vigilant, watching our minds, we can see, okay, well, this thought arises. Oh, well, that's a thought of, wanting to kill somebody. So, okay, I'll let that one go. There's a thought of telling a lie. Well, I'll let that one go. I won't follow that one. But here's a thought of kindness arises. And so, with the kusala karma, you don't just let go of the kusala karma. When a wholesome thought arises, or a thought of, look at that person. They're really having a difficult time. I wonder if there's some way that I can help them. That's not the time to say, oh, well, that's just a thought. Let it go. It's just a thought. I won't be attached to that thought. No, the Buddha said, unwholesome states of mind, let them go. Wholesome states of mind, you want to encourage them, develop them, allow them to come to fruition, allow them to grow, perfect them. So a thought of, compassionate action comes up. You wanted to help someone else out. Great. Then pay attention to that, because whatever we pay attention to grows and it becomes stronger. So we take our mind off of the unwholesome and we put our mind on the wholesome and encourage that. And this has a purifying aspect in our life. And gradually we change, our personality changes, our life changes. We make decisions not based on just is not just based on whether my ego is gratified. It's not based on whether it's even pleasant. Sometimes we have to do the honorable thing or the right thing, and it may not be pleasant. We may not get what we want, but we feel and we know that it's the right thing to do. So developing these wholesome states of mind. Now, if you're living like that, that is already exemplary. But even that much will not lead you out of samsara. Even that much will not be enough to attain awakening, that the Buddha says is the goal of his teaching. So purification of consciousness, then, is the next line. Now, all of this is a gradual purification of consciousness, but to uproot greed, hatred, and delusion, that can only come through insight. Developing wholesome states of mind, if you're developing mindfulness, it's going to increasingly make the mind more peaceful. Developing concentration temporarily creates a lot of purification in the mind. The only problem with samadhi is that it's temporary. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's very important. But then we use all of that momentum of good karma that we're making for developing insight. And then that really has the root. The ability to get at the roots. It's a bit like, I don't know if you ever do weeding, but sometimes if you just pull the top off of a weed, you don't see it for a while. But the roots are still there, and it doesn't take very long before it starts to grow back. So you really need to dig out the roots, and that takes a bit more effort. And that comes through essentially seeing through the delusion of self. The identification with his body, identification with his mind, perception, thoughts, moods, everything that we call ourselves, everything that we identify with. Ultimately, that's the source of why we experience difficulty and suffering. So, through insight, then, one is able to purify consciousness. And this is the teaching of the Buddha. Anupawado, anupagato, patimokkha jasangvaro. Not disparaging, not injuring, and living in the restraint of the Patimokkha discipline. So initially, not disparaging, again, not finding fault with others. Fault finding is so easy. If we could be enlightened by fault finding, that would be such a quick path. But even just being patient with thoughts of being critical is a full-time practice. Sometimes it's, we don't get what we want. It's uncomfortable. Someone's not doing what we think they should do. It's not good enough. Thoughts of criticism come up. Fault-finding. I'm suffering. I'm unhappy. I'm not fully satisfied because of that person or this situation. The situation's not right. That's easy. We can all do that very easily. But what's difficult is to take responsibility and say, well, if I'm not feeling fully satisfied right now, at least theoretically I should know that it's not the fault of someone else. It's not the fault of the situation being imperfect. It's really because I'm looking at things the wrong way. I'm interpreting things the wrong way. I don't have enough wisdom. I should try to maybe change my own heart. So again, not injuring others. sila, and living in restraint of the Patimokkha. At this time, when the Buddha was teaching, all of his disciples were fully enlightened, so there wasn't a whole lot of need for a detailed monastic code. So the Patimokkha has come to refer to the Buddhist monastic code, which is a guide, a very detailed guide for the monastic sangha. Now at that time, they were all fully enlightened, so they didn't need many rules. It was only later on, gradually, as the Buddha's disciples increased and more of the, say, people with more defilements started to join. And then they started to do some things which were inappropriate, and gradually the Buddha then would lay down rules, saying, well, this is inappropriate behavior. We'll make a rule. The people who ordain in the Sangha don't do that. So living within the restraint of a refined discipline, a refined sila. One of the things that attracted me to the forest tradition in Thailand was this emphasis on trying to follow the Patimokkha, the monastic code of discipline, in all of its detail. That was one of the unique features of Ajahn Chah's generation and Ajahn Chah's teacher, Ajahn Mun. Prior to that, there were very few people who would even think that it was possible to follow all of the monks' rules. Weren't even interested, or maybe were interested enough to study. Say, yes, it's very important to study them, but, well, we don't have to follow them. But it's very important to study them. But Ajahn Chah's teacher, Ajahn Mun, said, well, if that's what the Buddha taught, if that's really what the Buddha recommended, then let's see if it's possible to live just like they did in the time of the Buddha. So initially they were seen as radical, in some ways weirdos, who were trying to do this archaic practice of going back and following the lifestyle in the way they practiced in the time of the Buddha. And even in 19th century rural Thailand, they were saying, oh, this is the modern times. You can't practice like that. This is modern times. Get with it. You have to adapt to modern times. But they found out they could practice just like that. They could adapt their lifestyles. And then the respect for the Patimokkha, the monastic training as a tool of teaching became a key aspect of the training. It became a key aspect of the lifestyle. It takes a lot of restraint, especially in the beginning when you ordain. There's thousands of minor rules. Pretty much everything you have to do, you have to think, well, is this, am I breaking a rule? It's like, geez, am I breaking a rule? I don't want to break any rules. So initially, you have to study a bit, and you have to be careful not to get stressed out. Oh my God, there's so many rules. But once you start living the lifestyle, you realize, well, it all makes sense. And it's certainly possible to create a whole community based on this, not just in the time of the Buddha, but, here in the 21st century as well, still thriving. Still seems to be no problem being restrained within the discipline of the Patimokkha. The next line of the teaching goes, Matanyuta japata saming. So that's moderation in eating, encouraging moderation in eating. I think the Buddha definitely had the 21st century in mind. He was thinking ahead. Moderation in eating. But it was interesting, if you're talking to fully enlightened beings, you say, well, just don't eat too much, okay? Because he could have said, well, you're fully enlightened, so that's fine. You just go ahead and indulge. Have as many chocolate sundaes as you wish. It doesn't really matter anymore. You don't have to worry about defilements arising. Just eat as much as you want, anytime. But he didn't say that. He said, eat in moderation. And this quality of moderation then became an important example, because a lot of the people who were coming in, when we start the monastic life, we're not fully enlightened yet, right? So we do need moderation. And then the Sangha at that time needed examples of moderation. And the Buddha wasn't saying, don't eat at all, or just eat a few grains of rice once a day, or fast for extended periods of time. He was saying moderation, which is kind of a radical thing. Or, at the time it almost sounded soft, It was like when the Buddha was practicing his austerities so intensely, and then he decided to have some very simple food, just a little bit of very simple food. His 5 companions started to look down on him, so he's gone soft. But just eating in moderation. And one of Ajahn Chah's teachings, again, was in Thai it's called Bodhi, which means just enough. Whatever it is, just find that point of balance where it's just right, it's just enough. So when we eat, we'll think, well, what's the purpose of eating? Food is like medicine, right? Medicine for the body. We need a healthy body. We need food to give us strength. But for those people who are striving for Nibbana, then if you eat too much, you feel heavy. It's not conducive to meditation. It doesn't actually help the clarity of the mind. If you eat too little, then again, you don't have enough strength. Some people, if they eat too little, their minds become very restless. So he was encouraging people to find just the right amount. How much is just the right amount? So that it encourages health and well-being, but also clarity of mind. Now you can take this moderation principle into all areas of life. So as a monk, we are encouraged to reflect on our 4 requisites every day. So food is one of them, but then our lodging, so where we're living, is another. What we're wearing, our clothes and our medicines. So now in terms of where we're living, what's just right in terms of a house? It's very helpful to have a roof over our heads and something to protect us from the elements, and some place where maybe we can raise a family, and a place which is comfortable enough that we can come back to and has a warm, nurturing feeling for developing a family, or come back, or a place which is like a refuge, a peaceful refuge after a busy day. But beyond that, it becomes a burden. So finding this point of just right, just enough, just enough so that it actually supports our life. The purpose of a house is to give us pleasure. It's to make our life easier, right? But if our house becomes too big, then it's a burden. It's like, oh my God, it's never clean. I have to work so hard to clean it. It's too big. Or it just becomes a burden even just to pay for it. If it's too big, it's like, well, we got this great big beautiful house, but we don't actually own it. The bank owns it. And then we have to work so hard to pay off the bank, so we have this nice house that we hardly get to use the house. We hardly get to enjoy it because we're working so hard, and then when we get home, so tired, we just crash. So finding that point of just right, because, if we take society as our guide, then society's it doesn't hold just right as an important principle. They hold up excess, excess, or what's the purpose of a house? For a lot of people, the purpose of a house is to show off, is to increase the ego. But then that just creates more suffering, doesn't it? So finding a place of just right, doesn't need to, how much space do we need? Clothes. One of my favorite things about being a monk is I never have to worry about what I'm going to wear. And wherever I go, whatever I wear is perfectly appropriate. All right? I could be in the village on alms ground, walking barefoot, trying not to step in the water buffalo dung, and this outfit is perfectly appropriate. Or I could be invited into wealthy politicians' homes, surrounded by beauty, and this outfit is perfectly appropriate. I could be in a shopping mall, and this outfit is perfectly appropriate, and I have no desire to buy any other clothes. So there's a lot of freedom there. Just finding what is just right, just pour di, just enough. And so, obviously clothes they have a variety of purposes. One is to keep us warm and protect us from the elements, but of course there are other purposes such as what's appropriate for the office, home, etc. So for most people I do accept that you probably need more than one set of clothes. But probably not hundreds. So finding this point of, just right, how much do I need? How fashionable do I need to be? It's like, oh, look at that monk, he's got silk robes. Ooh, desire arises. No, just plain cotton's good enough. So this attitude of just enough, moderation in our life is actually very freeing. Instead of thinking that, we have to bend to all this social pressure to have this and that and the nice things are the biggest and the best and the newest. So, we don't have to. In fact, it's more peaceful if we don't. Patanja sayanasanang, living in seclusion, or developing seclusion. There are certain times where we need to remove ourselves from the intense busyness that we can have in our lives. Certain times where it's very helpful just to take time out. If you're leading a very busy lifestyle, even if you just take 15 minutes periodically and just sit quietly, have a little space in your home, have a space in your office, have a physical space, or if you can't do that, then just close the doors, lock the doors, sit quietly, just breathe, rejuvenate, experience some solitude. Now at the time of the Buddha, in terms of the monastic training, it was encouraged, strongly encouraged to, once you had a basis in the training, to go off and live in solitude, in the forest. And even the Buddha, once he was enlightened, still preferred to live in the forest. He loved being in nature, surrounded by nature. And if you've ever really kind of spent time in wilderness, you know the power that has. We have this wonderful branch monastery in Thailand. It's on the Burmese border. It's called Dao Dam. And for the whole time that I've been a monk, we've had that as a resource for our Sangha there. And we go there as a Sangha nearly every year. And the power of being surrounded by wilderness or thick jungle has a very different effect on the mind. Theoretically, wherever we are, if we're in the city or if we're in the forest, it's all sankharas arising and passing away. But practically speaking, if you're surrounded by trees rather than buildings, if you're in the mountains rather than in the ghetto, it has a very different effect on the mind. You're not surrounded by the creations of human egos. You're surrounded by trees, and you just feel the effect on the mind. It's very calming, and it gives rise to a sense of heightened awareness. So this was something that the Buddha encouraged, and it's still very good. It's still something worth incorporating into our lives. Taking time out, taking breaks, finding places which are peaceful and quiet, and spend time there, because the environment does play an important role. We can't help it. We're affected by our environment. So if we consciously are wise and choose the environment that we place ourselves in, then we can have a bit more control over how peaceful our minds are. When I teach retreats, I really like to get people out into the wilderness, staying in tents. And they have to be very patient. But the power of nature then becomes a very important teacher. And the next line is adhijite cha ayogo. Dedication to developing the heightened mind or heightened consciousness. So through this whole process, then it's good to remember, what's the point of it all? Developing a heightened consciousness. So it's not simply just watching everything arise and passing away, but certain things should be developed and refined. So systematically approaching meditation, putting one's heart into meditation, and developing deeper states of peace. In other places, the Buddha defines refined consciousness or heightened consciousness as the refined deep states of samadhi called jhana. And whether we experience jhana or not, if we can work in that direction as a long-term goal, then it's going to have a lot of beneficial effects on our practice. So devotion to the heightened mind. Say, well, this is something that's really worthy of devoting one's life to whatever degree that we're able to. Something really worthy of devoting ourselves to. The heightened mind. And the Buddha says, this then is the Buddha sasana. Etang bhuta nasasanang. This is the teaching of the Buddha. And that was the final end of his teaching. The final line. And then that teaching has come down to us today as the Ovada Patimokkha. So I'll offer this for your reflection.